G'day everyone. I was invited tonight to say a couple of words about my academic grandfather, the eminent Professor Richard Sharma. Now I could easily spend the next hour or so regaling you all about what an utterly incredible mind, an award-winning scientist, a prolific writer, a natural wit, a stunning beauty, and a downright terrific bloke that is Rick. But I wouldn't want to double up on what he was planning to tell you all about. Instead, I'll talk about a topic I have far more expertise in. Me. But I guess I'll weave in a little bit about how Rick, almost entirely without ever laying a hand on me, molded me into the dysfunctional human and semi-functional herpetologist you see here standing in front of you. Like many of you weirdos, much to my family's displeasure, I grew up innately obsessed with snakes. Growing up in Sydney's inner west with pommy parents, books were my only window into the secret lives of these bizarre and fascinating creatures. Of course, being a young boy with a short attention span and reading difficulties, I only really wanted to look at the pictures. I suppose that's what initially drew me to Rick's magnum opus, Australian Snakes, A Natural History. A brilliantly green python adorning the cover, a black-headed python eating a lace monitor, bockerdams, what the hell are those? A freakish file snake gagging on an eel-tailed catfish, and John Cann draped in scrub pythons. It was a young city boy's wet dream. If only I could get out there and find some snakes of my own. Although it felt like an eternity, probably no more than a few years later, I was of sufficient age and had the means and freedoms to obtain a train ticket. I could finally get myself to the outskirts of Sydney to look for snakes. So obviously, I'd wait for the hottest day of summer, because of course, snakes love heat, right? And I'd trek deep into the national park without water, only to return at the end of the day, sunburnt with a splitting headache and almost never having seen a snake. I just couldn't figure it out. Why couldn't I find any snakes? I'd resisted long enough. My 12-year-old arrogance could only get me so far. It was time to look beyond the pictures. So I sat down and I read Rick's book, cover to cover. My little mind was blown. It was as if the secret world of snakes I'd so desperately wanted to understand had been laid bare. Snakes were no longer a mystery. Armed with some ecological and physiological knowledge, kindly provided by Rick in easily digestible prose, I was armed with everything a young boy needed to go out and find highly venomous snakes in the wild. My parents were absolutely thrilled. A few years later, after having found much of the serpentine glory that Sydney had to offer, I knew it was time for a pilgrimage to the Northern Territory. Luckily for me, Brendan Shembry, Tom Parkin and I had met a snake-obsessed Darwin-based bloke on Aussie pythons and snakes who, on reflection, seemed a little too keen to have a couple of young teenagers fly up to Darwin to chase snakes around with. After meeting this fella at an AHS Christmas party at the Reptile Park in 2004, Brendan and I promptly booked flights to Darwin. And although my primary motivation for heading north was to find shitloads of big snakes, I secretly hoped to encounter the professor of snakes in his natural habitat. For that, I knew I needed to hit the infamous Fog Dam. Upon arriving at the then Sydney Uni Fog Dam Research Station, I'd envisioned I'd be greeted by the majesty of Rick as I pictured him in his book. A giant among herpetologists striding through the floodplains with a radio telemeter in one hand and a large king brown in the other. Instead, we were met by a disheveled hippie waist deep in a kiddie pool playing with toad poison reptiles. This man, described in Rick's cane toad wars as part hippie, part field biologist, part mathematical modeler, with a happy-go-lucky attitude, an engaging giggle that distracts you from his formidable intellect, was, although I didn't know it at the time, my future academic father, Ben Phillips. Ben broke the news to us gently. Rick does not in fact live on the floodplains amongst the water pythons and dusky rats. Instead, he lives and works in my hometown, Sydney. Perfect. That would certainly make stalking the man far easier. A few years later, after finishing school, I somewhat strategically enrolled in a science degree at Sydney Uni, the home of the Shine Lab and its namesake. My stalking could recommence. Shortly after starting, I finally plucked up the courage to contact the man directly. I emailed Rick and asked if I could organise a meeting. I still remember how nervous I was entering that purple office full of Herp books with a large framed picture of Demantia Shini as its centrepiece. But when I sat down to chat with Rick, his warmth and charm immediately put me at ease. He graciously listened as I spewed harebrained schemes for potential research collaborations. He let me ramble on for a while before saying, "And how are you doing at university? How are your marks?" Oh God, what was I going to say? That I was on academic probation for failing every unit I took in first year? That partying was my current primary endeavour? No, I told a white lie. Oh, you know, I'm doing all right. I'm passing most subjects. And as kindly as possible, Rick uttered a few words that genuinely changed the trajectory of my life. Get out of my office. No. Although I'm sure he regrets not saying that now. Instead, he told me that I was welcome to come along to Herp lunch meetings and volunteer in the lab. But if I ever wanted to do any research in the Shine lab, I was going to need to get at least a distinction average. And from then on, that's exactly what I did. With Rick's motivation, I put down the bottle and picked up the books. I finished my degree at the top of my classes. I could finally join the Shine lab. I immediately signed up to do honours under the supervision of Matt Greenleys and Rick. My childhood dreams of doing snake research with Rick Shine were finally about to be realised. That was, of course, until Rick and Matt explained to me how it was near impossible to do a decent research project on snakes in 9 months. They're just too bloody hard to find in sufficient numbers. They twisted my arm into researching the impacts of toads on wildlife in the southern invasion front in northern New South Wales, and I'm glad that they did. Through this experience, Rick taught me that it's not the study species that is important, but the scientific question you're able to answer while studying them. Most importantly, what I learned from Rick during this time was how to write, to cut the fluff and bullshit and get to the point. You're all here because you've read and loved Rick's writings, and that's the true genius of this man. His formidable ability to turn complex ecological and evolutionary data into a yarn just about anyone can understand and enjoy. With Rick and Matt's tutelage, I took home the university medal and was on my way to becoming a half-decent scientist. After finishing honours, I was broke and out of work, but Rick offered me a lifeline. He called me into his office and asked if I had any interest in working as a research assistant touring around North Queensland collecting cane toads. What a stupid question. Of course I was interested in driving around a beautiful snake-filled part of the country while getting paid. What neither Rick nor I knew at the time was that he was actually facilitating meeting my future wife, another snake-obsessed freak based in Cairns, the ecologically minded and artistically gifted Alana DeLay. I still have fond memories of our first date. With a desperately uninterested PhD student in tow, we trudged through the cane fields looking for taipans. I'm not sure if I ever told Rick about that part of the fieldwork, but I'm sure he would have been stoked for us if I had found the 7-foot taipan I was planning to impress Alana with. Alas, I had to rely on my devilish good looks and incredible wit to win her over. Over the next couple of years, love took me briefly to Cairns before the allure of a PhD with Ben Phillips drew me to Darwin. So after calling Rick to check I wasn't crazy leaving literal paradise on the whims of a man who I remembered as a disheveled hippie in a kiddie pool, but who Rick assured me was a literal genius and exceptionally nice guy, Alana and I packed up our life and hit the road to Darwin. And as we drove across Northern Australia, I remembered a passing comment Rick had said to me one day. If anyone could find a Demantia Shini, or as I like to call them, shiny Rick snakes, he'd write their PhD thesis for them. I'm sure it was tongue-in-cheek, but I was determined to hold the man to his word. After all, how hard could it be to find a needle-thin snake in a semi-arid haystack? Well, as it turns out, Shini are about as elusive as an academic career studying snakes. Over the next few years, despite months of dedicated searching in a particularly barren part of the country, I found a total of 9 shiny Rick snakes, all of them as dead as Rick's eyes, at the mention of a lizard on the cover of his snake book. Alas, I had no choice but to write my PhD thesis with only the skills imparted upon me by Rick's mentorship. I must admit, I've yet to read Rick's latest book, but I take solace in some advice that Rick repeatedly mentions. There are times in your career as a scientist when you're either reading or writing the literature. It's a funny statement for Rick to be so fond of, because given his frenetic output, I'm not sure at what stage in his career he intends to start reading. Unfortunately for me, I'm at a stage in my career with a 1-year-old daughter and students of my own where I'm neither reading nor writing the literature particularly effectively. Maybe I'd be better off getting back out there to find that elusive shiny Rick's name.
Very hot. So I'm going to cool it down. Mitch? Let's just move it on.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. And our final speaker before we move on to Rick himself, representing, I guess,